If you have studied the High Middle Ages in France for any amount of time, you've probably come across the name Fulk Nerra. Fulk Nerra means Fulk the Black. It is a title that was given to him obviously by monastic sources. His ancestors, his father Geoffrey Greymantle and Fulk the Good, both received those names while they were alive, but Fulk Nerra is something that comes after Fulk Nerra's death. So it's possible that he was called that by his contemporaries, but they didn't dare to write it because somebody who has the name Nerra, the Black, that kind of a character is someone you don't really want to get into a conflict with, especially over a name. But alas, he got it because he was notorious for his extreme temper and also for his not desecration necessarily, but his usage, his illicit usage, and maybe even abuse of monastic lands to gather men, materials, and resources that he was not supposed to have under medieval custom. So in order to actually talk about Fulk, it's important to talk about his family, because the Middle Ages, these families are giant agglomerations of people, giant networks over all sorts of places, that it's not a very nuclear family sort of structure. I don't want to talk about Fulk's ancestry and even everybody else so much. I just want to give a general idea of everyone he's related to, not everyone, but most, just so the rest of the story makes sense, because otherwise it won't make any sense. To start this hopefully short family thing, Fulk the Red's mother was a daughter of the Lords of Amboise. That's why Amboise is in Angevin hands, which will be important later. Fulk the Good had a daughter named Adelaide, who would marry the Count Walter of Vexin, Valois, and Amiens, who would be the ancestor of the Counts of Gâtinais, which would come back into the family later. One of Fulk the Red's sons was a bishop, and the other one was the Count of Anjou, who died in 960. He had, as his children, Adelaide Blanche, who married Stephen, Count of Gévaudan and Forêt. So those counties in southeastern France would be related to Fulk Nerra. He had Guy, Bishop of Le Puy, which was a title that was held roughly in the family by uncle to nephew to nephew to nephew. That was the idea. The same thing was the case in Le Mans as well. He also had Geoffrey Greymantle, who is the father of Fulk Nerra. Geoffrey Greymantle first married Adela Vermondois. They had first Hermengard Gerberga, who would be important for her marriages in terms of Fulk's relations to her husbands. Then Geoffrey and Adele had Fulk, and then they had Geoffrey. Geoffrey died young, though. After he died and Adele of Vermondois died, Geoffrey Greymantle remarried Adele of Chalon, and they had a son, Maurice, who would be the stepbrother of Fulk Nerra. Now for the story itself of Fulk Nerra. He was born in 970. Quickly, though, his family began to sort of disappear in front of his own eyes. His sister, who he didn't really even get to meet, married Count Conan of Rennes. Don't forget that his sister was a number of years older. Fulk was actually one of those long-awaited sons of a seemingly impotent medieval comital couple. Then, a couple years later, his brother was born, and then at the age of 4, his mother, Adele, died. Then, in 976, Fulk's brother, his younger brother, died as well. In 978, his father remarried Adele of Chalon, and a couple years later, Maurice was born. The source I used for this story, Fulk Nerra, the Neo-Roman Consul by Bernard Bachrach, to give credit, postulates that it might be that Fulk got his seriously aggressive and vicious character because of these losses in youth, and that sometimes youth nowadays exhibit similar characteristics when they've lost family and friends at very young ages and have to live in much more solitude that way. Also, Fulk's uncle Guy went to go become Bishop of the Puy in 975, so he was gone as well. In 986, Fulk married Elizabeth of Vendôme, whose father was a close ally to the Capetians as they were rising to power. His name was Bouchard. It also helped give northeastern help and defense to the Angevin county, which was to its southwest. And this was also the same year that Fulk was associated to the countship, one of the first, if not the first, comital son to be associated to the county. It's noted that during this time his father, Geoffrey Greymantle, brought him all over the county to visit his men in their fortifications and to secure their alliance and friendships, because without them the count could not rule. He needed his reinforcements. The next year, 987, Geoffrey Greymantle died, and the young Fulk was now the sole Count of Anjou. He had some allies, especially the Viscounts of Thouars. Aymery of Thouars was one of his greatest allies, but he would be betrayed later by him. After defeating Count Conan of Rennes at Conquereuil, Count Fulk would put Aymery of Thouars as the guardian of Nantes in his place for the young Judicael. But by building a castle in the south that was unpermitted by the Count, he would be antagonized and he would betray, with the others that Robert of Saint-Florent would dissuade from the service of Fulk, including the bishop of that city, Renaud, as well as his brother Fulcoius, the new castellan after their father Renaud had died. But this is a bit too early. They were persuaded away at a certain point by Robert of Saint-Florent. Saint-Florent was a monastery in what we might call, there weren't these strict borders, so there might have been a lot of territories, a lot of establishments that were controlled by the Angevin counts and count by this point. But there were always still pockets of other people's rights and privileges within those areas. So one of those was the monastery of Saint-Florent, which was a Blaisois, or of Blois, holding. So the abbot there was picked by the Count of Blois, who was basically always an enemy of the county of Anjou. Therefore, this Robert of Saint-Florent would try to sway his Fulk's allies away from him when he saw fit. He also wouldn't have liked the whole thing where Fulk would split the possessions. He would have the possessions of monasteries, not just Saint-Florent, but other ones. He would have them written down, and then he would split them, and then he would basically take control of half of them and use them for his purposes, which was seen as a serious abuse and might have given ample reason to call him Fulk the Black Nerra. He also had allies in Le Mans and Maine. There were lots of castellans there. At a certain point, maybe even at this point, the counts of Le Mans actually held their territory from Fulk and from the Angevin counts. There were a lot of family links, which was a big deal, and that's why I had to go through the introduction, which I'll have to develop again later. The Counts of Blois were always pretty much the main enemy, out of the first, out of the second. The Capetians flip-flopped quite a lot. They were usually allied with Hugh, but then Robert, his marriages with Bertha of Blois would upset things. In fact, since St. Martin of Tours was a royal monastery, even though it was quite close to Angevin lands, it was the treasurer was usually picked by the king, and so whoever he picked as the treasurer of Saint Martin was actually a pretty good gauge as to who who the king would be supporting at any given time. If he put someone in charge of Saint-Martin's treasury, which was a very rich monastery, by the way, if that person was of the Blois family or of the Angevin family, or related to someone somehow, that would be a pretty good indication of which side the king was swayed at that moment. Fulk was also allied with Count Adalbert of La Marche to his south. When Adalbert died, he made an arrangement of a marriage between his widow with William of Aquitaine, which saw Fulk make big gains in Poitou and near Saintonge. Now that William's son of Aquitaine, William the Fat of Aquitaine, was in no position to attack Fulk when his father had died, and he became pretty submissive during his time as count, even though he was actually proposed to become the next king of Italy at a certain point. Normandy was pretty hostile. Rennes was usually an enemy, and Nantes was also pretty inimical until it was conquered, and was usually a safe place when under the guardianship of the Counts of Anjou. Fulk started his career with raids into places like Blois, and he would make castles in those areas. Fulk is known for his castle building. It's actually one of the things that you might read about him if you ever just read about him in passing. It'll say he built a lot of stone castles, fortifications. He did so at first quite secretively, on purpose. He would use the rights he had over his subjects to compel them to build castles and fortifications and transport resources to those construction sites for him. But his first big victory would happen at just outside of Nantes at Conquereuil. The Count of Rennes Conan was allied with the Count of Blois, Odo, and it actually seems that the Count of Rennes held his county as a man of the Count of Blois, which was some kind of an alliance between the two. Fulk had to continuously fight on both sides, or make sure both sides of his county were secured, because Blois was on its east and Rennes was on its west. So if you let one go, the other could attack, and it could be a big problem. So he had to act quickly by going to Nantes to conquer it when it was challenged by Count Conan of Rennes. Because Nantes was supposed to be under Angevin control, but when it was being challenged by the probably stronger Count of Rennes, it became an issue, and Fulk had to settle the score. So when he sieged the city, he realized maybe he didn't have time. It was too big. It was a big fortification to fight. So he decided to challenge Count Conan of Rennes to a pitched battle at Conquereuil, because they had to settle on a place, and Count Conan agreed. So both sides made their way there. Of course, Count Conan went there first. He made it there first by a few days, and so he set up a camp, and then he had his men dig pitfalls and traps into the territory, into the land, so that when Fulk got there, it would screw up his advances, which is actually cheating in these ways. You weren't supposed to be doing this, but he did it anyways. So when Fulk showed up and the battle began, you can pretty much imagine how it went. He charged with his men, and they started falling into traps. Actually, Fulk was knocked off his horse at a certain point, but he was saved. And after an initial almost routing of his forces, he had his auxiliaries come in, flank, I believe with the sun setting behind them to blind the enemy, and they destroyed Conan's forces, captured him, and cut off his right hand. The sources seem a bit unclear as to whether Conan's right hand was cut off during the battle or after his being captured, but it seems that he was killed after the fact. The book I previously mentioned goes into this kind of Roman. The whole book is about trying to show how neo-Roman, so to speak, Fulk was in that time. I don't know if I like it so much. Maybe it seemed a bit forced. You could read it for yourself. I already cited it. But the author says that Conan's hand was cut off because that was what the ancient Romans did with usurpers. They would cut their hands off after a battle, after beating them in battle. So, it's possible, up to you to decide. At any rate, after Conquereuil, the resounding victory by Fulk, he was pretty much the western dominance for the time to come. He had gained full control at Nantes, and he went on to win other battles. He built constructions like at Langeais in the east, which was to challenge Otto of Blois. Otto found out about it, and he besieged it, but he did not succeed, and he even actually was helped by Hugh Capet, which is intriguing because you think at this time the kings of the West Franks are super caged in their little domain, but he still was able to get out, and he still did stuff like trying to help Fulk, his ally, against Otto, who was his very much nearer enemy. Hugh was able to get an arrangement between the two to have them lay off each other, and Langeais stood, but then Otto, of course, came back and did it again a couple of years later, and quickly after that he died, which is not really part of our story. But Fulk, in the time after that, captured Tours, which was a huge deal because that was kind of his main target for a lot of his career, but he could never actually really get it. He got it here, but that was pretty much the last time he would. He besieged it a couple times, but this was the only time he would ever actually control the city. Well, control it in whatever way he could, right? He didn't have the bishopric, but he at least had the city under wraps. He also had Châteauneuf. He captured Montsoreau. In 999, that's when he arranged for the marriage between William of Aquitaine and Aldebert of La Manche's widow, which saw in that treaty Fulk get Saintonge. By the year 1000, we see Fulk being hegemonic in the west, and he's defeated his enemies in the east, and he's also secured lands in the south. He has his allies with him. All are pretty much loyal. But we see in that same year, 1000, his first extreme showcase of aggression. His wife, he had known by some way. Don't forget that medieval counts, especially when they're on campaign, as often as Fulk was, weren't always with their wives and keeping tabs on what they were doing. So he finds out that his wife, Elizabeth of Vendôme, had been committing adultery with some other man in the city. So he goes to Angers. Angers, by the way, is the main city of Anjou. So he goes to Angers, where he goes to confront her, and she decides to hide herself in the citadel of Angers to barricade herself. And Fulk has no choice then but to besiege the citadel with his wife and her patrons inside. Somehow Elizabeth managed to fall from a high height. I don't know, maybe you could conjecture that she maybe did it on purpose. Either way, she fell from a high height, but she lived. And Fulk's men obviously seized her. Fulk then ordered for her to be burned for adultery, and Fulk was then a widower. He was single and quite the husband to have if you don't commit adultery. Pretty quickly after Fulk had his wife burned for adultery, a fire swept through the city of Angers, probably due to a lightning strike on a cathedral, which destroyed a lot of the city and was seen by the historical writers as possibly a sign of divine displeasure with what Fulk had done. In fact, natural events were included in those kinds of chronicles and annals, specifically because the monks writing them were looking for signs from God, omens, whether through weather, whether through other things. So half a city becoming a whole bonfire would definitely make them suspect that God had something to do with it. In the meantime, marriage issues got in between Fulk of Anjou and the Capetians. Hugh Capet had his son Robert II's marriage to Rosala of Italy carried out. She had been the widow of the Count of Flanders, and Robert didn't like her because she was too old, and he was disgusted by her, so he was able to get the marriage annulled. This will to separate had actually been something that cleaved Robert II and Hugh apart from each other, because so when Hugh died in 996, Robert was given free rein to do as he pleased by marrying, which was possibly not canonical, to Bertha of Burgundy, the widow of Otto of Blois, who was the antagonist of Fulk Nerra, who had worked with Count Conan and had besieged Langeais twice, among other things. Not to mention, Bertha and Robert II were second cousins, so it was hard to get approval, but they did, to marry by the Archbishop of Tours, named Archambault de Sully, which was struck down by the Popes Gregory V and Sylvester II as uncanonical, and they were subject to penance and excommunicated for what they had done. During that time, the houses of Capet and Blois were allies instead of enemies like before, which pushed Count Fulk of Anjou to the sideline and made him even an enemy of both. But it happened that Robert didn't have any heirs because of this incestuous liaison disguised as a marriage, basically, so he decided he had to call it quits with her and put her aside and picked up instead Constance of Burgundy, who was actually Fulk's cousin. In the introduction I had said before that Geoffrey Greymantle had a sister, Adelaide Blanche of Anjou. Adelaide Blanche of Anjou had a daughter named Adelaide Blanche, had married the Count of Provence, William, and the two in their, which this was Adelaide's second marriage, by the way, they had Constance, who would marry Robert II, King of France. Shortly after that, Fulk took one of his potential enemies and turned him into an ally. This was his half-brother, Maurice of Chalon, whose half-brother was supposed to be a cleric, with Maurice succeeding to the countship, but his half-brother had come back and kind of exposed Maurice. They were initially counts together, even though one of them was an ecclesiastic. So Fulk decides to bring Maurice to Angers and to make him a count as well, right before Fulk decided to leave on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Clearly he did this to keep some of his family in charge of the county while he was away, so that things wouldn't fall apart, or so he thought. So with Fulk parting on his pilgrimage to Jerusalem, I will leave this video the way it is and get into what comes after the pilgrimage itself and the following events in the next one. So thank you for listening if you are still here, and goodbye.